Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is essentially a Ukraine War Update Extra video. I haven't done one of these for a long time. I just thought I would do a bit of fact-checking or a bit of a corrective for people concerning defence expenditure for NATO. And actually understanding the US figures in their proper context, because people misunderstand the US figures, or at least don't fully recognise what goes into the US figures. It doesn't go into most other nations' figures. Okay, so first of all, in I think 2014, it was Obama's time, there was this agreement that each nation should spend 2% of their GDP on defence. In other words, GDP, gross domestic product, what you are worth as a country, what you produce each year, kind of one metric of measuring kind of, how wealthy you are as a country. And if you are generating X amount of GDP, then 2% of that needs to be spent on defence to make sure that people are spending broadly the same amount on defence, and therefore there aren't free riders who are getting away with one side spending lots on defence, and then when you have a military defensive alliance, when it comes to it, you've got one side that's been doing a lot more heavy lifting in terms of spending on equipment and whatever, and that they end up doing, as I say, more heavy lifting in terms of the actual defensive maneuvers or whatever it is. And you might have this country down here says, oh yeah, actually I know you spent like 2.5%, we spent 1%, and actually I know you're getting us to do this training, but we don't have that much stuff, or when we're actually called into the invocation of Article 5, actually we can't really help that much, so we're kind of free riding on the safety blanket of NATO. So 2014, they're like, okay, well, some of us are spending way more than others, so let's try and aim for 2% of our GDP in order to make sure that we're all paying broadly the same proportional amount. And in 2014, I think there were 3 countries, there was maybe 4, there was certainly the US, interestingly Greece, because Greece has this ongoing conflict with Turkey, ongoing tensions with Turkey concerning Cyprus, and Great Britain, I think, was the third one. And I think we ended up doing something funky. So the thing is, there's no conformity with regard to what defence spending actually is. So I do believe, if I remember correctly, David Cameron said, okay, we're not quite meeting 2%, so we're going to add our pensions in, our military pensions in. So it's not expenditure on defence, if you like, but these are people who were in the armed forces, and as a result of being in the armed forces, we pay them slightly better pension, and that pension's quite expensive, so we're going to throw that in. And as soon as that goes in the military budget, then it skews things, and actually we're spending a lot more. Thank you very much. It's 2%, but we weren't actually. It's not like we're spending more on the armed forces. We just changed the way we understand the figures. So there are these controversial things that you can do, or differences between nations of how the defence spending is defined. Okay, then so here's the big point of today. And I talked about this with Jake Bro, and it was like a real light bulb moment. So the US goes around and says, hey, hang on, we spend way more than you on defence, right? So if we look at the actual NATO defence expenditures, this is from June 2024, the latest figures. And actually, there are a bunch of nations who are now declaring they're going to spend more. You've got 2 new nations in there, of Sweden. I don't even know if they are on this. So you've got Sweden and Finland in there. I'm pretty sure Finland's going to be there as well. There it is. But some of these nations have said, right, we're going to spend way more next year, etc., etc. What we are looking at is the dark blue lines here. So here's your NATO guideline of 2%, and you have some countries. So that Poland at the moment now is on for 4.12%. That was in June of this year. We have Estonia on for 3.43%, and the US in third place on 3.38%. Now, the US is going to be saying, I think, putting pressure on nations to start spending 3%, because Trump basically wants an excuse to get out of NATO by accusing all of these other nations of free riding. Now, there is kind of free riding going on. So Spain, Slovenia, Luxembourg, Belgium, Canada not spending nearly enough is the claim, and Italy and Portugal on top of that, and Croatia, all under 2%. And you can look at this and say, hang on, we are spending 3.38% of our GDP on defense, and you guys are spending 1.81% in Croatia. So we are doing way more than you, and you are failing to comply with the required standards. But the thing is, that's a really unfair comparison, because the US DoD has it. So you've got to remember that the United States does not have a single payer healthcare system. There isn't a universal healthcare system. Sorry. They have all sorts of different things going on with regard to private healthcare, insurance, Medicare, and you have non-insured people, underinsured people, insured people. And when it comes to getting injured, if you're in the armed forces, you will have the armed forces basically insurance package or whatever, and that will get you your healthcare. Whereas if you're in the British Armed Forces and you get injured, you just go to a hospital and you get treated, right? But that treatment doesn't go into the military budget, but the American treatment does go into the military budget. So when the US go, hey, look how much we're spending on defense, a massive proportion of that, like a really huge proportion of American military expenditure is on healthcare, where it is not for most other countries. So the US military healthcare benefit, the MHS, provides healthcare to eligible beneficiaries, including active service military members, retirees, and their families. So you've got the families of the military people, the retirees, and those serving, and all of that healthcare expenditure comes out of the military budget. It's absolutely incredible. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's apples and oranges, it's apples and bricks in comparison to other nations. And if you then look at the US contribution, so if you got Trump sounding off about how we spend this much, he needs to frickin' understand that it is an unfair comparison. So we've got 3.38% there. How much of that is actually spent on healthcare? Well, someone told me, so Viggo Holmsen today said rightly that take a look at how defence expenditure is built up in NATO regulations, what can be included and what has to be left off. However, expenditures such as healthcare and pension, for example, are included in US budgets, while in most European countries they are not. So I don't even know about pensions and which countries do include. I use the example of the UK including that, but it said without those elements included, US expenditure drops from where it is now to 2.64%. So it then comes down to, they then slip down to here. So when they are broadly there, like what right do they have to lecture everyone else in the kind of way that they, well, not they, but people like Trump and his lackeys will lecture everyone else, but actually they're a lot further down than you might think. So just to go back to the Google AI here, saying MHS is funded by the Unified Medical Budget, UMB, which is a significant line item in the military budget. NATO members are committed to spending at least 2% of their gross domestic product on defence. However, some countries include healthcare, foreign aid, social spending, or education in their defence budgets. So you can argue that the education of military children with particular military schools gets included, and then that, for other countries that might come under general education budgets, etc., etc. So unless we get a fair comparison across the board, then these numbers are only a very rough guideline at best. And it could well be that if everyone was treating their budgets in the same way that the US does, that everyone here would be well over 2%. It's just hugely important. So, however, some countries include all these other items in their defence budgets, which can lead to differences in reported figures. For example, Denmark's official defence budget is different from the figure it reports to NATO because it includes spending on healthcare and state pensions. US contribution to NATO is about 2/3 of NATO's annual defence spending. And we're going to talk about this in a second, just because there is a bit of a fact check going on here. So we know that the US spends more than the next 12 countries in a row in terms of the actual expenditure on defence. And as such, when it comes to their expenditure of 3.38%, even if you take out that healthcare provision, you will have a huge expenditure because their GDP is massive. Like the US GDP is much, much bigger than many of these other countries. And so they spend an awful lot on their defense. And as a way of looking at that in terms of a proportion of all, so if you added up all of the defense budgets of all of these countries and then took the US out, the US would represent like 2/3 of all of these defense expenditures, because actually you look at the GDP of the US, some of these countries are only like a 2 million, 3 million, 1 million size countries, and the US is 350 million with a massive GDP. So as a proportion of the entirety of the expenditure on defense of all these countries, the US represents about 2/3. But it doesn't mean that it pays for 2/3 of the NATO budget. That's a very different thing. So when we talk about paying for NATO, which is often how someone like Trump would couch the subject, we're not really paying for NATO. What he's really talking about is how much are you paying on your own defense. The cost of NATO is going to be the buildings and the power and some of the training maneuvers and the budget for some staff members who are particularly NATO and NATO uniform or whatever. So you have all of this these NATO costs. But what Trump is normally talking about is the expenditure on defense. When it comes to spending on NATO costs, the US picks up 16% or 15.8% of that annual budget, not 2/3. They spend 2/3 of the amount that everyone spends on their own defences as a total of everyone's defences. And Reuters talks about this. Washington finances 15.8% of the military alliance's yearly expenditure, which is about 3.5 billion. It's the joint largest share alongside Germany's. So Germany spends about the same as well. So there's been all this disinformation. Though. Widely viewed posts said the US paid 860 billion to NATO, making up 66% of the budget of 1.3 trillion. That's not a budget. NATO doesn't have that budget. That's the combined expenditure on people's defences. That's spent in your own countries, on your own people, and your own stuff. Sometimes you'll be ordering from abroad and you might have people positioned abroad and some of that money goes abroad, whatever. But generally, it's you spending on yourself. And they do 2/3 of that heavy lifting. So I thought that would be worth explaining. But certainly the differences in how we equate our defence budgets can lead to wildly differing evaluations of who's paying what and who's doing well and who isn't. And if all of these, if these countries had, I'm not saying they all have universal healthcare, but if they have healthcare for their armed forces that sits outside of their military budget, they might have the old military hospital here or there. I used to live in Old Naval Hospital in Gibraltar, right, which was previously a naval hospital. So I don't know whether that would have fallen under our, when it was a naval hospital, whether it fell under our military budget or our healthcare budget. But if these guys aren't including their healthcare for their military and their retired military and their family members, then that's completely unfair comparison. And pensions. So how much of a proportion of the military budget is are pensions in the American expenditure, and does everyone else include that? So this is only a very rough guide, and it could well be that if we were comparing apples to apples, actually everyone was above 2% and broadly in the same, much narrower section of the graph. So let me know what you think, guys. I think it's important to make sure that we understand these figures and to call people out when they are talking about NATO expenditure and defence expenditure, and that the US does X compared to another country that does Y. But actually, those figures are based on two very different calculations. Take care. Speak to you soon.